In 1986, when I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs that had been started by Richard Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters. The sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the US blew up. Today, we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough on crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the U.S. prison population, disproportionately locking away black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana. People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis, but there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above-ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana, they're still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated 50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above-ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, police issue possession citations in black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared this so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
Right. All right. Get my mic together before I get started. All right. So I'd like to welcome y'all to episode 13. Um, Obviously, we're going to talk about the war on drugs today, but just to give you some feedback from the opening video, that was pretty profound, right? So last episode, I established how the modern policing system was inherently built to protect the interests of the government and the policy of the government, right? And it was never about protecting the common people. Now we're going to look today and see how the drug war was specifically designed to attack minorities in urban environments, right? The war on drugs is never about the war on drugs. Last episode, I told you how the policing system works to keep crime out of the white community, and the war on drugs is the same concept, right? They want the drugs out of the upscale communities, and they want it concentrated in urban environments. Urban environments primarily have the demographics of black and Latino of people that live there. So you can see how this is something that they do by design, right? So before we get into the history, I just wanted to show you something about how this country was built. Because a lot of people think this country was built on patriotism and people with good moral systems, right? Remember we talked about in episode 6 how morals define the individual. Well, check this out. First screen. America's first millionaire got rich smuggling opium. So America's first millionaire got rich by smuggling dope, not from working hard, not from creating something that benefited mankind, right? Not from discovering some science or some philosophy that made humanity better. He got rich from smuggling opium. He even has a place named after him in Manhattan called Astor Place. John Jacob Astor fed a growing international addiction and helped fuel a 19th century opioid crisis. So you see how history repeats itself, right? I'm just gonna give you a brief history of this dude, and you can see how international international drug smuggling was how a lot of these old millionaires made their money. When business legend John Jacob Astor died in 1848, he was hailed as a titan of trade and praised as a sharp salesman with a taste of philanthropy. There are a few men whose biography would prove more instructive or more acceptable for the present age of life than John Jacob Astor. But today, one facet of the first multimillionaire's biography might seem to tarnish his shining legacy: his dabbling in smuggled opium. Astor's enormous fortune was made in part by sneaking opium into China against imperial orders. The resulting riches made him one of the world's most powerful merchants and also helped create the world's first widespread opioid epidemic. So the very first cartels, right? The very first international drug cartels were not Mexicans. They were not Colombians, right? They were Anglo-Saxon white males, right? And what they did was they imported their drugs into foreign countries, most notably China, right? The Chinese emperor actually issued an edict preventing or banning the usage of opium in China, and England totally disregarded this and flooded China with all types of opium, right? China was they were the leader of trade even back then, right? China was the leader of trade. A lot of the European explorers used to go to China and get their supplies from China because China always had a rich cultural history. China's been around for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands. China existed the Bible. How you love that? Most of these countries that you see in the eastern part of Asia, they pre-existed the writing of the Bible. So China has always had a rich history, and the Europeans knew this. So their whole idea was to what's the term I want to use? Destroy Chinese culture, Eastern culture, right?
Explicit it,
Yeah.
take advantage of it.
So let's look at who this Astor guy was. Born in Germany, Astor's enterprising spirit took him abroad when he was just 18. He ended up in the United States at a time when the country was in the midst of a new love affair with China, right? So not only was he an international drug smuggler, he was an immigrant, illegal immigrant, right? So we had illegal immigrants trafficking opium, right? As Astor began to sell furs in New York, he kept tabs on America's new China trade. The country had a long-standing obsession with Chinese goods, especially the tea that had fueled revolutionary sentiment against the United Kingdom. During British rule, American trade was under England's thumb, and the East India Company had a monopoly on trade with China. The Revolutionary War changed that, and the new United States, now free of the monopoly, could trade freely with China. American ships began to sail directly to Canton, and the flow of commerce that followed made millionaires out of the intrepid men who plunged into the trade. So you see, the whole idea that America had been beefing with China is nonsense, because for the better part of 300 years, America has always been dealing with China because the majority of stuff that we need comes from China. Silk was one of the main things that we use for our fabric. It comes from China. You know what I'm saying? Marco Polo was going to China. That's where spaghetti comes from. It's originally called lo mein in Chinese culture, and we know it now as spaghetti or whatever type of noodles. You know what I'm saying? But in China, it was known as lo mein. This is the influence that China had on the ancient world. You know, Astor began to import Chinese tea and silks and to flirt with another way to get in on the trade boom. The China trade was an early engine of American investment. The merchants who became millionaires thanks to commerce with China also became philanthropists. But there was a downside. These American fortunes, for all their good works, must be weighed against the damage that was done in acquiring them. That damage took the form of drugs, namely opium. Since there wasn't much demand in China for Western goods, England and the United States made up for it by providing something that was. They used the profits from opium to purchase tea, pottery, and fabrics that they'd resell back home. This also allowed merchants to get big around a big technical challenge, an international shortage of silver, the only currency the Chinese would take. Opium was technically banned in China, but merchants like Astor found a way around the ban. Large ships containing gigantic hauls of opium met small vessels outside of legitimate ports and swiftly unloaded their illicit cargo. Bribery was common, and officials who had taken bribes looked the other way instead of enforcing anti-opium laws. Astor knew that the British ships usually smuggled in premium opium from India, but he wanted to get a foothold in the opium trade. For his first salvo, he purchased 10 tons of Turkish opium in 1816. The quality wasn't as high as Indian opium, but it was still in demand. Dealers cut Indian opium with their Turkish supply. Astor shipped the opium to China in exchange for goods that he resold in the United States. So you see, like the whole concept of selling drugs didn't originate in urban communities, right? It didn't originate in the projects. It didn't originate in Puerto Rico. It didn't originate in Colombia. It didn't originate in Mexico. Okay? It was a form of international commerce that pre-existed all of that. Right? Before Mexico even existed as a country, before Colombia even existed as a country, your boy John Jacob Astor was already running around as an international drug smuggler. Right? He was the one who had the first. He was one of the first. There was people even before him. The Dutch trading company, the India trading company, they smuggled opium. Right? And it's telling you here that he didn't even sell good opium. He bought cheap opium and cut it with the good opium and sold it to the Chinese people because the Chinese people didn't need nothing from the United States. The only thing that they needed from England and from the United States was the drugs. And he was made sure that he put it right there front and center, right? Let's continue. It isn't clear how much opium Astor sold during his years as a drug smuggler, and the business was just a lucrative sideline to his even more profitable fur trade. But Astor is thought to have sold hundreds of thousands of pounds between opium between 1816 and 1825, when he stepped away from the China trade for good. According to historian John Kuwei Chin, Astor even brought opium to New York, openly selling it and even advertising it in New York newspapers. Okay? Here you see a picture of what the opium dens looked like back in the 1800s. This was an epidemic in the United States, and you got to understand, we had a large influx of Chinese immigrants that came over here to build the railroads, right? The Chinese built the railroads here in America. And a lot of them were hooked to opium that they were introduced to by Astor and people like Astor, right? United States had banned opium. And this guy made a lot of money, right? There's a place in New York City, you go to New York City, right? There's a train station called Astor Place. They named the train station after this dude. You know what I'm saying? Rockefeller Plaza, right? You got all these places named after all these tycoons, right? These industrialist tycoons who made money, slavery, through human trafficking, through drugs, and all these people get statues and they're considered as heroes, but your neighbor get caught with a couple pounds and he's locked up for 25 years of his life and his name is slandered in the street. Something ain't adding up, right? We're going to get into all of that. All right? So, this is just a brief history. Now we're going to get into specifically America, right? Because, you know, we ain't here to talk about what China doing. We're here to talk about what's going on in America. So, I'm going to give you a brief history of prohibition and how it affected the shaping of America. Many current illegal drugs such as marijuana, opium, coca, and psychedelics have been used for thousands of years for both medical and spiritual purposes. So why are some drugs legal and other drugs illegal today? It's not based on any scientific assessment of the relative risk of these drugs, but it has everything to do with who is associated with these drugs. Okay, I'm going to repeat that last sentence again. It is not based on any scientific assessment of the relative risk of these drugs. That means that there wasn't no scientific assessment in determining whether these drugs are illegal or not, right? But it has everything to do with the people that are associated with moving these drugs. The first anti-opium laws in the 1870s were directed at Chinese immigrants. This is what I was just telling you. The first anti-cocaine laws in the early 1900s were directed at black men in the South. Coincidentally, this came right after Reconstruction, right? You got to understand the lower class white demographic and the middle class white demographic didn't really have any work skills because all the work skills were in the hands of the slaves. They were the ones that knew how to tend the fields and work the machines. So when they were freed during Reconstruction, they had a large influx of the black community come up to the northern part, and what happened was they had it was an issue with the jobs, right? You know what I'm saying? They felt like, oh, these blacks are coming to take our jobs, right? Because they the ones that had the labor skills that they brought with them from the South. A lot of people don't know this, but the original Coca-Cola had cocaine in it. That's why it was named Coca-Cola. You know, after they passed the Harrison Act, they took the cocaine out of Coca-Cola, but a lot of the medication that doctors would give you back in the day contained real morphine, which is comes from opium, contained real heroin, contained real cocaine in it. So let's continue. The first anti-marijuana laws in the Midwest and the Southwest in the 1910s and 1920s were directed at Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans. Today, Latino and especially black communities are still subject to widely disproportionate drug enforcement and sentencing practices. Okay? And now we're going to look at where did this came from. In the 1960s, as drugs became symbols of youthful rebellion, social upheaval, and political dissent, the government halted scientific research to evaluate their medical safety and efficiency. In June 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs. He dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies and pushed through measures such as mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. Right, and these were things that really affected the urban communities, the minority communities, right? And we're gonna get into later why, right? We're gonna show the CIA connection and how the role the CIA played in developing all this. But right now, we're just looking at the basis of the foundation of the war on drugs. A top Nixon aide, John Ehrlichman, later admitted, "You want to know what this is really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people." You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Nixon temporarily placed marijuana in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category of drugs, pending review by a commission he appointed led by Republican Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer. Okay? So, this was a political move to start this war on drugs. Nixon's opponents was the liberals, right, and black people. And this is according to his own personal aide, right? His personal aide is the one who has access to Nixon all the time. So his personal aide is revealing that Nixon felt that he was at war with liberalism and the black. Now, you can't make black being illegal, right? They tried this already. We talked about this in the last show. They came with the black codes. They came with Jim Crow, right? And all of this, African-American community was overcoming all of this. You look at the pictures of the African-American community in the 50s and 60s, everybody was wearing mink coats and furs and had new cars. Everybody, right? The projects was never built for the African-American community. It was built for the Germans and the Irish and the Italian immigrants that came in the 1920s, right? So let's continue on. In 1972, the commission unanimously recommended decriminalizing the possession and distribution of marijuana for personal use. Nixon ignored the report and rejected its recommendations, okay? Between 1973 and 1977, however, 11 states decriminalized marijuana possession. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter was inaugurated on a campaign platform that included marijuana decriminalization. In October 1977, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted to decriminalize possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana for personal use. Okay, so the hunt for legalization has been going on since the 70s. So everything that's happening now with legalization is something that's been in the pipeline since the 70s, right? But the reason why it's been in the pipeline for legalization was never for us to enjoy it. It was for them to enjoy the fruits of the benefit of legalization, which is why they created this multi-billion-dollar market marijuana industry now. You know what I'm saying? Within just a few years, though the tide had shifted, proposals to decriminalize marijuana were abandoned as parents became increasingly concerned about high rates of teen marijuana use. Marijuana was ultimately caught up in a broader cultural backlash against the perceived permissiveness of the 1970s. So this was like during the big hippie movement, right? The hippie movement was going on. This was the anti-war movement for Vietnam. And the best way to make marijuana look and vilify it was to attach it to people that are considered anti-patriotic, right? Or attach it to the black community or attach it to any type of minority community, right? Again, urban communities weren't the cesspools of crime that they are now. You understand? That was by design. Now we're going to look into the 80s, right? And the 80s is the introduction of the crack era, right? The whole thing with marijuana wasn't working, right? And the African American community had found a way to overcome the first heroin. You know, this started from Vietnam. So here I'm going to read this. I'm going to read this little excerpt from CIA.gov. This is CIA documents, right? This is directly out of the horse's mouth, and they're going to explain to you what happened in Vietnam and how the first opioid crisis took form. So the following excerpt is from the testimony of General Lewis Waltz, United States Marine Corps retired. On August 14th, 1972, was taken in the late afternoon when most of the press had left the hearing room. Because of it, subject matter here is a transcript of that portion of the testimony. The heroin epidemic, this article is titled "The Heroin Epidemic in Vietnam." And this is from General Lewis Waltz, okay, in front of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, August 14th, 1972, okay? In Vietnam, the prime focus of our investigation was on the heroin epidemic among the American armed forces. We wanted to find out as much as we could about the epidemic itself and about the effectiveness of the countermeasure which had been instituted in the fields of detection, rehabilitation, and education. The epidemic hit in the month of June, immediately after our Cambodian incursion had devastated the enemy sanctuaries and supply caches in the Parik Beach area. I'm going to start right there because it's important to note that in the 1970s, Vietnam and Cambodia were the places where the highest percentage of opium was cultivated, right? So it's no coincidence that the United States was there. So when United States, it's like when United States goes to war with a country, there's usually some hidden agenda behind it. So in Vietnam, the hidden agenda was the cultivation of opium. Right? This is why in the 1960s and the 1970s, the heroin epidemic was really big in the urban communities. We're seeing that now again with the Afghanistan, because now 90% of the world's heroin supply comes from Afghanistan, right? And guess who's there guarding the opium fields? It's American troops. So I'm going to continue on. Almost overnight, heroin of remarkable purity, 94 to 97% pure, became available in unlimited quantities to the American armed forces in the greater Saigon area. Initially at the price of $1 a vial, later at an average price of $2 a vial. Within 2 months, the epidemic has spread to cover virtually the entire country, right? Within a few months' time, death from heroin overdoses climbed from 2 a month to almost 70 a month. There are varying estimates as to what percentage of our armed forces became involved in the epidemic, but certainly it ran into many thousands. Naturally, it varied from unit to unit. Major Jerome Charles, psychiatrist for the 101st Airborne Division located in 1st Corps, estimated in a statement to the Senate Juvenile Delinquency Subcommittee that 40 to 50% of the men in his division had either experimented with or were hooked on hard drugs. Although the overall official estimate was substantially lower, it was clear that we were confronted with a situation of catastrophic dimensions. Now think about this for a minute, right? 40 to 50% of a division is about 5,000 to 6,000 troops, right? The average American army division is about 10,000 or 15,000 men. So 50% of this is 7,500 men in one unit, experimented or are actively addicted to heroin, right? And heroin is a heavy narcotic, right? It puts you straight to sleep, right? So these are the troops that you got on the front line trying to win a war, right? Half your troops are asleep on the front line. And then you want to know why American soldiers suffered such high casualties during the Vietnam War, right? Because the Vietnamese didn't do heroin, right? They didn't do heroin. They cultivated and they grew it. Just like the Taliban, they don't do heroin. They cultivate it and they grow it, right? But it was our soldiers that went over there, right? That didn't want to be over there. They got drafted to go over there. They got sent over there illegally. And a lot of them picked up this bad habit and brought it back home with them when they came. So now when you look at Harlem in the 1960s and 70s, right? When you look at Philadelphia in the 1960s and 70s, when you look at all these major cities in the 1960s and 70s, right? They have heavy heroin epidemics. And most of the people that are addicted to heroin were the soldiers that this country, right, put on such a high level that they venerate, and they did nothing for them, right? The Vietnam soldiers were not given a parade when they came home. As a matter of fact, they were treated like shit by the majority of the community. Right?
And you know, sometimes it wasn't just the abuse of it, but being introduced to it on a the doctor prescribing it to you, or here, shield this pain for you, or that got them strung out too.
So like one of the main things, like, I don't know, for anybody that's ever been in the military and been in combat, when you get wounded, right, they shoot you with a morphine vial, right? Morphine is a very strong concentrate that comes from opium. It's basically a stronger version of a medical use of heroin, right? And morphine is really strong, right? So when these guys would get wounded in combat, boom, the first thing they give them was a morphine vial, right? Well, what happened is that they grew an addiction to this. Just like anybody that goes to surgery nowadays. If you ever go to surgery nowadays, they'll give you like Percocet 30s or Percocet, a heavy form of Percocet or oxycodone, right? Well, this is how addictions are started, right? You take one and it feels good and you're like, damn, I don't got no pain no more, right? And then you take two and you're like, damn, I ain't got no pain no more. Then you take three and you're like, damn, I ain't got no pain no more. Then before you know it, you're taking 10 of them, right? Just to feel normal. Because the more that you take, your body develops a tolerance. And this is true in any form of drug, whether it's weed, cocaine, alcohol. Your tolerance over time builds up. And as your tolerance builds up, you need more of the initial drug to get you to feel just to that level of normalcy. And this is how drugs make a lot of money, right? Everybody's always chasing that initial high, right? So we'll come back to this in a minute, but I really want to get into the 1980s because the 1980s is directly relevant to a large majority of my peers, right? And is directly relevant to me. So we're going to look at this. This particular article is titled, "The CIA, Contras, Gangs, and Crack." Okay, so you can share it to my screen right here because I'm about to go in on this article right here. This is important. This is from the Institute of Policy Studies. I'm going to share, matter of fact, I'm going to share the link right now into the chat so you guys can read along. Where's my Discord? Right. Share this in the chat so y'all can read along on the process, okay? Based on a year-long investigation, reporter Gary Webb, rest in peace, reporter Gary Webb, because this information cost him his life. Okay, so rest in peace, Gary Webb, because he was one of the original tellers of the truth, and it cost him his life. This information that I'm about to share with you cost a man his life. Based on a year-long investigation, reporter Gary Webb wrote that during the 1980s, the CIA helped finance its covert war against Nicaragua's leftist government through sales of cut-rate cocaine to South Central LA drug dealer Ricky Ross. This was published in November 1996. In August 1996, the San Jose Mercury News initiated an extended series of articles linking the CIA's Contra Army to the crack cocaine epidemic in Los Angeles. Based on a year-long investigation, reporter Gary Webb wrote that during the 1980s, the CIA helped finance its covert war against Nicaragua's leftist government through the sales of cut-rate cocaine to South Central LA drug dealer Ricky Ross. The series unleashed a storm of protests spearheaded by black radio stations and the Congressional Black Caucus, with demands for official inquiries. The Mercury News webpage, with supporting documents and updates, received hundreds of thousands of hits a day. While much of the CIA Contra drug story has been revealed years ago in the press and in congressional hearings, the Mercury News series added a crucial missing link. It followed the cocaine trail to Ross and black LA gangs who became street-level distributors of crack, a cheap and powerful form of cocaine. The CIA's drug network, wrote Webb, opened the first pipeline between Colombia's cocaine cartels and the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles, a city now known as the crack capital of the world. Black gangs used their profits to buy automatic weapons, sometimes from one of the CIA-linked drug dealers. Okay, so before I continue in the article, right, I'm going to give you a brief history of who the Nicaragua leftists were, right? This was the Sandinista movement, right? So in the 1970s and the 1980s, right, after the end of the Vietnam War, the United States wanted to switch their area of operation, their theater of operation, to Central America, right? They wanted to prevent the spread of communism in Central America. That's always their go-to playbook, right? To stopping the spread of communism. In reality, it was to install puppet governments in Central America to support the drug trade, right? If you look at the emergence of all the Mexican cartels and the Colombian cartels, all of them came after the expansion of American interest into Central America. So the cartels are a direct result of American expansion into Central America, because before that there was no cartels, right? While much of the CIA Director John Deutsch declared that he found no connection whatsoever. So this is funny because they had the CIA investigate themselves and they determined that they were innocent, right? The CIA director declared that he found no connection whatever between the CIA and cocaine traffickers. So you have somebody from the CIA investigating the CIA, which makes no sense to me. That's a direct conflict of interest. Major media like the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post have run long pieces refuting the Mercury News series, right? Now, we know that New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post are owned by the very same people that perpetuated the drug war, right? They deny the Bay Area-based Nicaraguan dealers Juan Norin Meneses and Oscar Danilo Blandon worked for the CIA or contributed millions of dollars in drug profits to the Contras, as Webb contended. They also note that neither Ross nor the gangs were the first or sole distributors of crack in LA. Webb, however, did not claim this, right? So what they did was they created a false idea of what Webb said. Webb never said that Ricky Walsh was the first. You know what I'm saying? Let me get my spot back. He wrote that a huge influx of cocaine happened to come at just the time the street level dealers were figuring how to make cocaine affordable by changing it into crack, right? Now, not to get sidetracked, but how many of you people really think that some dude in the projects really had time to sit there and think about the chemical components that make crack cocaine, right?
Right.
You really think that somebody that dropped out of high school and had no knowledge of science or chemistry or physics really just sat there and thought, hey, I'm going to take this crack cocaine and I'm going to add this element to it and add this element to it and change it into a whole new drug?
Change it to a whole new compound.
Methamphetamines was developed in a lab. Ecstasy was developed in a lab. LSD was developed in a lab, right? The CIA has this all on record. You know, the original form of ecstasy was developed as a truth serum, MDMA. It was developed as a truth serum, and they were going to use it to interrogate prisoners, right? And the idea behind the pill was they would take the pill and it would induce a form of, I'll tell you the truth about anything. It was supposed to be like a truth pill. Right. Same thing with LSD. LSD was supposed to be something that they used for mind control. Crack cocaine is no different. Crack cocaine was specifically designed for the inner city communities, and the reason for it is because it's cheap, right? You could buy a crack rock for $5 to $10, right? And most of the people in the inner cities didn't have the well-paying jobs that can afford an 8-ball of cocaine, right? They couldn't afford an ounce of cocaine, but they could afford a $10 rock. They could afford a $20 rock, right? So the whole idea was to get a wide to get a wide influx of new users for cheap, right? Many in the media have also postulated that any drug trafficking Contras were involved were rogue elements not supported by the CIA. But these denials overlook much of the Mercury News evidence of CIA for complicity. Now we're going to look at the evidence that we have that shows that the CIA was directly involved with drug trafficking. The CIA supplied contraplanes and pilots that carried cocaine from Central America to U.S. airports and military bases. In 1985, Drug Enforcement Administration agent Celerino Castillo reported to his superiors that cocaine was being stored at the CIA's Contra supply warehouse at Lopango Air Force Base in El Salvador for shipment to the U.S. The DEA did nothing, and Castillo was gradually forced out of the agency. Matter of fact, the CIA was called Air America. So let me look up Air America real quick. They actually made a movie about this back in the 80s. Air America, right? Do a live research real quick. All right, the only information that I have here about Air America is their air operations in Laos, but it's the same concept, right? You can put it on my screen real quick. Now, Air America was something that they started in Vietnam, right? This is how they were moving the drugs from Vietnam into America. If you ever seen the movie American Gangster, right? The story of Frank Lucas, he kind of tells the background story of how he was going to Thailand and Laos, right? And he was using American military as the pilots to bring his supply here to America. Air America is an airline secretly owned by the CIA, was a vital component in the agency's operation in Laos. What they don't tell you is that it never ceased to operate after Laos. They continued to use it all the way through the 1980s because this was the primary method of their delivery of drugs to American continent. By the summer of 1970, the airline had some 24 twin-engine transports, another 24 short takeoff and landing aircraft, and some 30 helicopters dedicated to operations in Laos. There were more than 300 pilots, co-pilots, flight mechanics, and air freight specialists flying out of Laos and Thailand. During 1970, Air America airdropped or landed 46 million pounds of foodstuff, mainly rice, in Laos. Okay, so the official narrative that they're going to give you about Air America is that it conducted these airdrops in Laos and Cambodia and things like that. But what they won't tell you is that Air America is what they use to bring the drugs from Central America to America, specifically United States, LA, right? And it was the CIA that did this. Okay, let's continue with the evidence. When Danilo Blandon was finally arrested in 1986, he admitted to drug crimes that would have set others away for life. The Justice Department, however, freed Blandon after only 28 months behind bars and then hired him as a full-time DEA informant, paying him more than $166,000 salary. When Blandon testified in the 1996 trial against Ricky Ross, the Justice Department blocked any inquiry about Blandon's connection to the CIA. So this is something that the CIA and the DEA still does to this day. When they arrest a high-level drug dealer, they usually do not go to jail. What they do is they flip and they turn them into high-level informants. Then what the CIA or the DEA or the FBI likes to do is they give these informants a salary, right? They give them money. And the whole idea is that they can continue living their lifestyle as a drug lord, right? So they go into a city. Let's say they get a guy from Detroit, right? And they bring him here to Cleveland. This guy gets an apartment. He gets a nice car, right? He fits the characteristics of a drug lord. Now he goes into the inner city communities and he looks for the small level distributors. And he goes to them and he says, yo, man, I heard you looking for a connect, a supplier. I can help you, right? And, most people from the inner city don't really got no intelligence when it comes to shit like this. So, they all chasing money. Everybody want to get the bag, right? So what they usually do is, I found a new connect, man. He's giving me player price on everything. I'm getting the kilos for 1980 prices, right? 12.5, 13.5, 14.5, right? Because we're going by 1980 prices, right? So now, they started making money, right? Everybody's making money. They got their little block set up. Now all of a sudden, people start catching cases, right? But then you start looking at the people underneath you because you're like, damn, who told on me? It's the people underneath me telling on me, right? And the whole time it's the dude that you was buying your work from that's setting you up with the feds. You know what I'm saying? Your supplier was the police. There's an axiom in the hood: you buy your first and last kilo from the police, right? And the reason for that is because most of these dudes that can afford to buy 50 kilos, 100 kilos are working with the DEA. Okay? That's how you get the money to buy 50 to 100 kilos. Nobody in the hood got $300,000, $400,000 to go fly to Colombia and meet with Pablo Escobar and negotiate that kind of transaction. The DEA does. The FBI does. Right?
Right.
You growing up in the projects, how you gonna get your 50 kilos from Colombia over here? Explain that to me. Right? How you gonna get your 5 kilos from wherever? You see what I'm saying? The absurdity of it is ridiculous.
And
you know what I'm saying? The absurdity is ridiculous. It's always been the police and the government at the top moving the work.
And if you can afford something like that, you probably wouldn't even be selling drugs in the first place.
Right. If you got $400,000 to go buy that much work, why you don't own no real estate and no property?
Right. You'll be doing something else.
So let's continue with this. Although Norwin Menezes is listed in DEA computers as a major international drug smuggler implicated in 45 separate federal investigations since 1974, he lived conspicuously in California until 1989 and was never arrested in the United States. Okay? So this is a man that's on 45 different federal indictments, right? Never was arrested. 45 different federal indictments, never was arrested.
That's nuts.
Okay? Senate investigators and agents from 4 organizations all complained that their Contra drug investigations were hampered. Webb wrote by the CIA or unnamed national security interests. In 1984 Frogman case, for instance, the U.S. attorney in San Francisco returned $36,800 seized from a Nicaraguan drug dealer after 2 Contra leaders sent letters to the court arguing that the cash was intended for the Contras. Federal prosecutors ordered the letter and other case evidence sealed for national security reasons. When Senate investigators later asked the Justice Department to explain this unusual turn of events, they ran into a wall of secrecy. Okay? So the Frogman case was a situation where the DEA actually arrested a Nicaraguan drug lord, right? And gave him his money back because the other drug lords in Nicaragua said, we need that money for the Nicaraguan Sandinistas. You don't have no right to take that money. And then made them seal the documents that had anything to do with that. Okay? So this is the same government that y'all put y'all faith in, that y'all go vote for, right? That y'all sit there and bootleg for, right? Y'all sit there, Republican, Democrat, right? And you getting finessed by your government in every capacity. I already made 13 episodes, bro, right? And in every episode, I talk about a different aspect of the finesse of the same government that people have a tendency to put their faith in, right? And it's ridiculous that I still have to explain this in 2020. You know what I'm saying? But here I am. So now we're going to continue to look at the history of CIA involvement. In my 30-year history in the Drug Enforcement Agency and related agencies, the major targets of my investigations almost invariably turned out to be working for the CIA. Dennis Dale, former chief of the elite DEA enforcement unit. So the leader, the former chief of the DEA, is on the record saying that in his 30-year history, almost every major investigation that he has done has led back to someone working for the CIA. Okay? And I got more bad news for y'all that like to put these drug lords on a high pedestal. Pablo Escobar, El Chapo, right? All of these guys that y'all hold in high regard and y'all look at them as trappers of the year, CIA assets. Okay? Just so you know. The foregoing discussion should not be regarded as any kind of historical aberration, inasmuch as the CIA has had a long and virtually continuous involvement with drug trafficking since the end of World War II. World War II ended in 1945. We are in 2020, okay? That's almost 90 years of drug trafficking that they did with impunity, and they locking up our family members for it. Because ain't nobody from the CIA in jail for this. I went to prison. Half of the people on my timeline went to prison, right? My father went to prison. A whole bunch of people in our families went to prison for something that is controlled and manipulated from the very top, and none of those people go to prison, okay? 1947 to 1951. We're going to go through the history of all of this.
You flaming this up. You flaming it up, man. You flaming it up.
CIA arms, money, and disinformation enabled Corsican criminal syndicates in Marseille to wrest control of labor unions from the Communist Party. The Corsicans gained political influence over the control over the docks, ideal conditions for cementing a long-term partnership with mafia drug distributors, which turned Marseille into a post-war heroin capital of the Western world. Marseille's first heroin laboratories were opened in 1951, only months after the Corsicans took over the waterfront. So for many of you, if you ever heard the term the French Connection, this is what the French Connection is. The French Connection was the French suppliers who were they were using Turkish heroin and they were supplying the mafia. This is why the mafia got so powerful in the 1950s and 60s, because they were the primary distributors of Turkish heroin. Like I told you earlier, Turkish heroin was better than was cheaper, right, than the Indian heroin, right? So they could get more of this Turkish heroin, and then what they do is they would cut it and they would sell it on the market for massive profits, right? So the mafia was making major money, right? They were making major money in the 1950s. This is how they were able to buy political help. This is how they were able to buy construction companies. This is how they was able to buy all that political power, police departments. Mafia had whole police departments on their payroll. You know
they got control of the waterfront, which is said right there. Yeah.
So now moving forward to 1950s, the Nationalist Chinese Army, organized by the CIA, again, the CIA is here, to wage war against Communist China, became the opium baron of the Golden Triangle, parts of Burma, Thailand, and Laos, the world's largest source of opium and heroin. Air America, the CIA's principal proprietary airline, flew the drugs all over Southeast Asia. So this just was confirming what I was telling you about Air America, right? Excuse me. The official mainstream narrative is Air America was flying over Vietnam and Cambodia, and they were dropping supplies and they were helping the poor. In reality, they were moving tons and tons and tons of opium, right, and poppy from Cambodia and Laos, and they were moving it to United States distributors, such as Frank Lucas. He wasn't the only one, but he was one of the popular ones of that time, right? You also had Nicky Barnes. You also had a lot of these high-level heroin dealers that we look at as high level. They were actually at the bottom of the totem pole. You know what I'm saying? When you're talking about international drug dealers, right? These guys were actually at the bottom. They were the distributors.
Yeah, the infrastructure goes up far up out the pyramid.
But we could also see how foreign governments worked directly in cahoots with the CIA, right? 1950s to early 1970s. During the U.S. military involvement in Laos and other parts of Indochina, Air America flew opium and heroin throughout the area. Many GIs in Vietnam became addicts. A laboratory built at CIA headquarters in northern Laos was used to refine heroin. Let me repeat that. A laboratory built at CIA headquarters in northern Laos was used to refine heroin. Okay? Again, heroin is street level production of the poppy. Okay? There is no medical use for heroin. Okay? Let me repeat that. There is no medical use for heroin. The only medical use for opium is through morphine. There is no medical use for heroin. So why are they refining heroin at a CIA laboratory? Okay? Southeast Asia had become a source of 70% of the world's illicit opium and major supplier of raw materials for America's booming heroin market. And where was America's booming heroin market? In inner city communities like Harlem, like Philadelphia, like Chicago, like LA, right? You got to understand, this was the time of what they call the white flight, right? This was the time when a large majority of the white communities were living in the inner city, and they didn't like the influx of middle class working blacks. They didn't like that, so they took their money and they bought houses out in the suburbs, right? This is what you see. Like East Cleveland is a perfect example of this. If you go to East Cleveland right now, there's still $1 million mansions in East Cleveland.
Yes.
You know who used to live in East Cleveland? The Rockefellers used to live in East Cleveland. Now you go to East Cleveland and it looks like a war zone, right? But it's by design, because East Cleveland initially was Millionaires Row.
Yes.
If you go to East Cleveland in the 1960s, 1970s, it was Millionaires Row. Even to this day, some of the houses there still cost $1 million.
They're huge. All the houses over there.
The Rockefellers lived there.
That's how they were able to split them all into duplexes and all that other stuff.
1973 to 1980 in Australia, because this is international, right? The Guggenheim Bank of Sydney was a CIA bank in all but name. Among its officers were a network of U.S. generals, admirals, and CIA men, including CIA Director William Colby, who was one of its lawyers. With branches in Saudi Arabia, Europe, Southeast Asia, South America, and the U.S., Guggenheim Bank financed drug trafficking, money laundering, and international arms dealing. In 1980, amidst several mysterious deaths, the bank collapsed, $50 million in debt. Okay, so what the CIA likes to do is they create shell companies or banks, right? That are not really banks; they're just shell companies that they're funded by the CIA. And what they do is these are the banks where they launder their money, right? Now we're talking about high level drug trafficking, right? No, that nobody's going to jail for, but they locking people like me up for low level shit, right? 1970s to 1980s in Panama. For more than a decade, Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega was a highly paid CIA asset and collaborator. Despite knowledge by U.S. drug authorities as early as 1971 that the general was heavily involved in drug trafficking and money laundering, Noriega facilitated guns for drug flights for the Contras, providing protection and pilots, safe havens for drug cartel officials, and discreet banking facilities. U.S. officials, including then CIA Director William Webster and several DEA officers, sent Noriega letters of praise for efforts to thwart drug trafficking, albeit only against competitors of his Medellin cartel patrons. The U.S. government only turned against Noriega invading Panama in December 1989 and kidnapping the general once they discovered he was providing intelligence and services to the Cubans and Sandinistas. Ironically, drug trafficking through Panama has increased after the U.S. invasion. So in 1989, the United States invaded Panama and arrested General Manuel Noriega. They didn't arrest him for drug trafficking, right? They arrested him because he was giving information to the competition, right? When he was working against Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, right, they was all for General Noriega, right? Because he was getting them the dope cheaper than Pablo was. Pablo wanted to tax him because Pablo was he was the top dog. He was the man all the way at the top, right? And he was taxing the CIA. So they needed another source. You know, if anybody knows how the drug game works, you go to the cheapest supplier, right? That's how you're going to make maximum profit. So United States, they wanted to get a cheaper supplier, right? And they wanted to get Pablo Escobar. He didn't want to work with them anymore, so they had to get him out of the way, right? So they take Pablo Escobar out, and they elevated the Cali cartel. The Cali cartel was, they were a little bit more business oriented, right? These were businessmen. This was Pablo Escobar's arch rivals, right? Pablo Escobar, he was more of a cowboy. You know, he liked to blow things up, and he liked to use terrorism. The Cali cartel, they were more about running businesses and doing business the way the CIA does. So the CIA had no problem doing business with them. For a long time, the CIA did business with the Cali cartel. Then when they didn't need them, they did the same thing. They took them out, right? Let's continue on. 1980s Central America. The San Jose Mercury News series documents just one thread of the interwoven operations linking the CIA and the Contras and the cocaine cartels. Obsessed with overthrowing the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua, the Reagan administration officials tolerated drug trafficking as long as the traffickers gave support to the Contras. In 1989, the Senate Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations, headed by John Kerry, concluded a 3-year investigation by stating there was substantial evidence of drug smuggling through the war zones on the part of individual Contras, Contra suppliers, Contra pilots, mercenaries who worked with the Contras, and Contra supporters throughout the region. U.S. officials involved in Central America failed to address the drug issue for fear of jeopardizing the war efforts against Nicaragua. In each case, one or another agency of the U.S. government had information regarding the involvement either while it was occurring or immediately thereafter. Senior U.S. policymakers were not immune to the idea that drug money was a perfect solution to the Contras funding problem. Okay? Now, the reason why they did this is because the United States government can't openly go give money to an organization that's trying to topple a government. Okay? They can't do that openly. Okay? So what they do is they do it covertly. And covertly meaning we'll bring in the drugs, we'll give it to the suppliers. The suppliers will then sell the drugs, right? Give us the money, and then we'll give you the money through your third party, fourth party affiliate, and then you could use that money to fund the revolution. This is how the United States, they've been doing this for thousands of years, or not thousands of years, for hundreds of years, and they're going to continue to do this because this is their policy. Okay, this is American foreign policy. The Contras provided both protection and infrastructure, planes, pilots, airstrips, warehouse, front companies, and banks to these CIA-linked drug networks. At least 4 transport companies under investigation for drug trafficking received U.S. government contracts to carry non-lethal supplies to the Contras. Southern Air Transport, formerly CIA-known and later Pentagon contract, was involved in the drug running as well. Cocaine-laden planes flew to Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and other locations, including several military bases, designated as contracraft. These shipments were not to be inspected. When some authority wasn't apprised and made an arrest, powerful strings were pulled to result in dropping the case, acquittal, reduced sentence, or deportation. Okay? So anytime that the Drug Enforcement Agency or the FBI would investigate this, they nipped it in the butt right at the source, right? And CIA made sure that none of this ever got out in the open. To this day, nobody from the CIA, FBI, Drug Enforcement Agency that was involved in any of this is doing any type of jail time, right? But 70 to 80% of the people locked up in America right now are minorities for low-level drug crimes or low-level drug offenses, right? 1980s to early 1990s. Check this out. The CIA supported the Mujahideen rebels engaged heavily in drug trafficking while fighting the Soviet-supported government, which had plans to reform Afghan society. The agency's principal client was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, one of the leading drug lords and the biggest heroin fighter, who was also the largest recipient of CIA military support. CIA supplied trucks and mules that had carried arms into Afghanistan and were used to transport opium to laboratories along the Afghan-Pakistan border. The output provided up to 1/2 of the heroin used annually in the United States and 3/4 of that used in Western Europe. U.S. officials admitted in 1990 that they had failed to investigate or take action against the drug operation because of a desire not to offend their Pakistani and Afghanistan allies. In 1993, an official of the DA dubbed Afghanistan the new Colombia of the drug world.
So,
right?
so that's
What a coincidence.
That's Desert Storm time right there, right?
What a coincidence. We're in
Wow.
Afghanistan now, using American military troops to guard the poppy fields, right? Check this out. Let me switch articles real quick. You can show my screen for this. Opium poppy production in Afghanistan, right? Afghanistan is the source of more than 90% of the world's opium supply and more than 95% of the European opium supply since 2001. 2001 was the year 9/11 happened. Okay? The planned events of September 11, 2001 set in motion a series of United States military occupation of Muslim countries that had nothing to do with exacting justice, but it had everything to do with controlling the drug trade. If you notice, the opium epidemic in America coincidentally started right when we invaded Afghanistan. Okay? I just showed you how in the previous article, right? How in the 1980s, Afghanistan was already big in heroin supply, right?
Yep.
Since we've invaded Afghanistan, production has went up 90%. Okay? Why? If we have American troops, right? We have American troops in there. Why is the heroin production in Afghanistan going up? Let me continue. So let's go right here. I'm going to look at this chart. This is what I'm looking for right here. Since United States military occupation of 2001, followed by NATO occupation in 2003, opium production has increased exponentially. Areas under Taliban control had zero production prior to 2001. Okay? So now we look at 2001. This was heroin production right here in 2001.
Hold control. Roll the middle mouse button up.
Right here. This was heroin production in Afghanistan prior to the invasion. If you see, it's barely on the chart. It's like 8,000 tons. Okay, right. This is heroin production right now, or this was in 2017, 3 years ago. It's at 328,000 tons yearly.
Wow.
Okay, they went from 8,000 tons yearly to 328,000 tons yearly under the protection of the United States military. This is not up for debate. This is not speculation. This is not conspiracy theory. This is irrefutable facts. Okay. This is Afghanistan right here. This is Afghanistan on the map. Okay, this is Afghanistan in the map. Okay. All these regions around here along the border, right? Along the border down here and along the border with Pakistan are heavy opium producing areas, right? So the reason why we never won the war in Afghanistan, right, is because every time we would go into an area, the Taliban would just go over the border into Pakistan, right? And we can't go into Pakistan, right? So the whole idea, right? The whole idea with this with the drug war is a finesse. Let me continue reading this information because I got a lot and I want to get this done before 12:30. This is mid 1980s to early 1990s in Haiti. While working to keep Haitian military and political leaders in power, the CIA turned a blind eye to their clients' drug trafficking. In 1986, the agency added some more names to its payroll by creating a new Haitian organization, the National Intelligence Service. Mandate included countering the cocaine trade through SIN officers themselves engaged in trafficking, a trade aided and abetted by some Haitian military and political leaders. So, how did this affect us, right? Well, if you remember in the 1980s, Miami was really big in the cocaine trade, right? They made movies like Scarface. They made all these movies highlighting how big cocaine was in Miami. And many of the drug lords in Miami at the time were Cuban and Haitian, right? But what they don't tell people is that a lot of these Cuban drug lords and Haitian drug lords were CIA assets. Okay? They were being paid and they were put in place to be the drug lords that they were by the CIA. Okay? Because everything with the CIA is about control. It's never about prevention. Everything with them is always about control and regulation, right? Now, the article stops here. I accidentally read the 1980s and 1990s first before the 1980s, but we could see, right, that the CIA has been at the forefront of the drugs since the end of World War II, right? They're the suppliers, they're the pilots, they're the refiners, right? So the biggest drug dealers in the world right now are the CIA. Now let me show you this because I want you guys to see this because this is important. I'll show you when to load the screen, Paul. Give me a second. Now check this out. Let's share my screen. The United Kingdom is the world's biggest importer of legal cocaine.
Legal.
Right? The country has bought more than 80% of all illicit cocaine around the world. Okay? Cocaine hospitalizations in the UK have shot up by 90% since 2014. Why? Because coke is currently purer than it's been in decades, and throughout the country, it's just as easy to order a pizza because the war on drugs is lost and British drug policy is trash, right? Campaigners argue that the first step to minimizing the harms caused by cocaine, both to humans and earth, is decriminalization and regulation. Critics contend that this wouldn't work for a number of reasons, one of which, how would you even start to go about building the infrastructure needed to produce and transport legal cocaine around the world?
Well, CIA has been doing it since World War II.
Exactly, and check this out. I'm going to show you something else. One second. Right? So let me share this article right here. Once the cocaine has been legally produced from the coca leaf, it is exported to various countries for medicinal use, right? Basically, as a topical anesthetic, in the United States, the crystalline powder is imported to pharmaceutical companies who process and package the cocaine for medical use. Merck Pharmaceutical Company and Mallinckrodt Chemical Works distribute cocaine in crystalline form, hydrochloride salt, and dark-colored glass bottles to pharmacies and hospitals throughout the United States. Cocaine in the alkali form, base drug containing no additives such as hydrochloride in the crystalline form, is rarely used for medicinal purposes. Cocaine hydrochloride crystals or flakes come in 1/8, 1/4, or 1 ounce bottles from the manufacturer and has a wholesale price of approximately $20 to $25 an ounce, 100% pure. Cocaine is still a drug of choice among many physicians as a topical local anesthetic because the drug has vasoconstrictive quantities as it stops the flow of blood oozing. And although synthetic local anesthetics such as Novocaine and Xylocaine have been discovered and are used extensively as local anesthetics, they do not have the same vasoconstrictive effects as cocaine.
Right.
So this company right here, Merck Pharmaceutical, right? They legally import right? This company, you can go on Wikipedia right here. Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals is an Irish tax-registered manufacturer of specialty pharmaceuticals, generic drugs, and imaging agents. In 2017, it generated 90% of its sales from the U.S. healthcare system. Okay? While Mallinckrodt is headquartered in Ireland for tax purposes, right? So check this out. They're headquartered in Ireland for tax purposes, so they don't get finessed by the American government because they're selling all this legal cocaine in America, right? Its operational headquarters are in the U.S. Mallinckrodt's 2013 tax inversion to Ireland drew controversy when it is shown Acthar was Medicaid's most expensive drug, right? And basically what this company is legally allowed to import tons and tons and tons and tons of cocaine legally. They buy the coca leaves from Peru, right? Send them to their laboratories, and then they refine it, and then they sell it to different pharmaceutical companies, right?
Pretty sure that's not owned and operated by anyone from any city growing up.
Right. Now, albeit they're allowed to import legal cocaine, but how can we guarantee that all of their cocaine that they're importing is being used for medicinal purposes? When we already clearly showed, right? Cato Institute has already processed 4 decades and counting the continued failure on the war on drugs. So let me share these articles in the chat. Right? Private individuals and policymakers often utilize prohibition as a means of controlling the sale and manufacture the consumption of particular goods. While the 18th Amendment, which was passed and subsequently repealed in the early 20th century, it is often regarded as the first major prohibition in the United States. It was certainly not the last. The war on drugs, begun under President Richard Nixon, continues to utilize policies of prohibition to achieve a variety of objectives. Right, so like our first idea of prohibition, they used it with alcohol, right? And this is how Al Capone and all these bootleggers of the 1930s made a lot of money. They would go to Canada and they would get the liquor or process the liquor there and then smuggle it back to America and sell it for 20 times, 30 times the value of what they took to process it. I mean, regular business in the drug game is not that much different. As a matter of fact, the two are interconnected, right? Our economy would collapse if the drug game didn't exist. That's the reality of it. You know what I'm saying? And this is why the drug game exists, because without it, our economy would collapse. They don't tell you this, right? Because they want to portray the image that America is this place built on firm morals and one nation under God, right? The people in government don't even worship God. How you love that? Most of the people in government don't even care about God or the concept of God, right? Because if they did, they wouldn't be using the CIA to bring in drugs and destroy your communities, right? If they really cared about God or the concept of it. So they're just being hypocrites, right? I want to touch into this real quick, and then I'm going to begin to close it up. This particular article is how the CIA watched over the destruction of Gary Webb. Gary Webb is the guy that revealed a lot of this information that I'm sharing today, and this information cost him his life, right? 18 years after it was published, Dark Alliance, the San Jose Mercury News bombshell investigation into links between the cocaine trade, Nicaragua's Contra rebels, and African-American neighborhoods in California remains one of the most explosive and controversial exposés in American journalism. The 20,000 word series enraged black communities, prompted congressional hearings, and became one of the first major national security stories in history to blow up online. It also sparked an aggressive backlash from the nation's most powerful media outlets, which devoted considerable resources to discredit author Gary Webb's reporting. Their efforts succeeded, costing Webb his career. On December 10th, 2004, the journalist was found dead in his apartment, having ended his 8-year downfall with 2 .38 caliber bullets to the head. Okay, so they're trying to say that he committed suicide by shooting himself twice in the head. Who shoots themselves twice in the head? Who does that? Right? It's physically impossible to shoot yourself twice in the head because the first bullet is going to put you down. But they're saying that he was found having ended his 8-year downfall with 2 .38 caliber bullets to the head. Okay,
38 hits you.
A revolver. Right? So the bullets can't be traced. These days, Webb is being cast in a more sympathetic light. He's portrayed heroically in a major motion picture set to premiere nationwide next month, and documents newly released by the CIA provide fresh context to the Dark Alliance saga. Information that paints an ugly portrait of the mainstream media at the time. Right? On September 18th, the agency released a trove of documents spanning the 3 decades of secret government operations, called from the agency's in-house journal, Studies in Intelligence. The materials include a previously unreleased 6-page article, Managing a Nightmare, CIA Public Affairs, a Drug Conspiracy Story. Right? And I'm going to share the story. I'm going to share the article with you so y'all can read it. Right? Straight out the CIA's mouth. Right in the chat. Right? In the Discord chat. I don't know if they can see it on here. But Paul, can you do me a favor, and whatever links are in the Discord chat, can you put it in the Facebook chat too? So they could get it? All right. Right? Okay. Thanks in part to what author Nicholas Dumajovic, a CIA Directorate of Intelligence staffer at the time of the publication, described as a ground base of already productive relations with journalists. The CIA's public affairs officers watched with relief as the largest newspapers in the country rescued the agency from disaster and in the process destroyed the reputation of an aggressive, award-winning reporter. Gary Webb wasn't a conspiracy theorist. Okay. Prior to him releasing this information, he had all journalistic accolades and awards. So he was on the highest totem of journalistic veneration until he released the information that actually told the truth about how your government manufactures and ships drugs all over the world and have been doing it for hundreds of years, right? Remember, I told you, America's first millionaire was an opium smuggler, right? This guy. John Jacob Astor, America's first millionaire, was an opium smuggler, okay? Continue on. Webb's troubles began in 1996 when his employer, the San Jose Mercury News, published a groundbreaking 3-part investigation he had worked on for more than a year, okay? Webb series reported that in addition to waging a proxy war for the United States government against Nicaragua's revolutionary Sandinista government in the 1980s, elements of the CIA-backed Contra rebels were also involved in trafficking cocaine to the U.S. in order to fund their counter-revolutionary campaign. The secret flow of drugs and money, Webb reported, had a direct link to the subsequent explosion of crack cocaine abuse that had devastated California's most vulnerable African-American neighborhoods. The TV show Snowfall, have you ever seen the TV show Snowfall that they give? It's telling you the story of this. This is what it's telling you the story. It's telling you the story of how the CIA came in, they looked for African-American distributors in LA, and they were supplying them with unlimited supplies of cocaine through the roof. About millions of tons, okay? Derided by some as conspiracy theory and heralded by others as investigative reporting as its finest, Webb series spread through extensive talk radio coverage and global availability via the internet, which at the time was still a novel way to promote national news. Through Dark Alliance would eventually morph into a personal crisis for Webb, it was initially a PR disaster for the CIA. In Managing a Nightmare, Domovich minced no words in describing the potentially devastating effect of the series on the agency's image, right? The charges could hardly be worse. A widely read newspaper series leads many Americans to believe CIA is guilty or of at least complicity, if not conspiracy, in the outbreak of crack cocaine in America's cities. In more extreme versions of the story circulating on talk radio and the internet, the agency was the instrument of a consistent strategy by the U.S. government to destroy the black community and keep black Americans from advancing. Denunciations of a CIA reminiscent of the 1970s abound. Investigations are demanded and initiated. The Congress gets involved. Right? Last episode, I specifically showed you how American police, right? American police departments are specifically designed to keep crime out of affluent white communities, right? And to keep crime regulated to urban environments, right? Now, the CIA is a national version of this. So you think that the CIA is really trying to protect the interests of the common people when they are building international banks for money laundering and moving thousands of tons of cocaine and heroin all over the world? Where do you think fentanyl comes from? Fentanyl is used as a surgical anesthetic. Nobody in the project has the laboratory or the knowledge of chemistry to manufacture fentanyl. Okay? Fentanyl is manufactured in a scientific lab, just as most of these illegal drugs, right? Because a lot of people don't realize this, but drugs are natural resources that are converted into synthetic drugs, right? Cocaine comes from the coca leaf. Heroin comes from the opium plant. Marijuana grows on a plant, right? Even alcohol. A lot of alcohols come from plants, potatoes. Vodka is made from a potato or fermented from fruit, from fruit, right? So a lot of the stuff that we put in our body to catch a buzz comes from a natural source. It's the government that takes it and converts it into something else, to a synthetic form, right? We don't have the capabilities to do this. We don't have gun laboratory to make guns. We don't have none of this in the inner city. We are just the tools that they use to get all of this out into the collective consciousness of our reality. And this is why we're failing as a society, because we don't see the deception that our government uses to keep us at the bottom of the totem pole. We can't see the deception. You know what I'm saying? We over here worrying about killing somebody else for a block that we don't own, right? We want to sit here and hate on the next man because he's making a couple more dollars than us. But the people that are making all the money and making all of this possible, y'all don't say nothing. Y'all stay quiet, right? Matter of fact, a lot of y'all work hard to try to be just like them. You know what I'm saying? Y'all work very hard. The minute anybody get a little couple dollars, they want to get they get a little house. They move to the suburbs, right? And they start identifying themselves as upstanding members of society, right? And they start judging people, not understanding that all the deception comes at the top. People at the bottom don't have no power to deceive anybody. They victims. You know what I'm saying? We victims of this. We victims of the drug game. We not perpetuating this. I took it upon myself to remove myself from this bullshit. You know what I'm saying? That's all I could do. I can't control what the next man do and how the next man get his money, but I can control how I get my money. So I remove myself from this bullshit because I ain't in the process of working for police. You understand? And that's what you're doing. When you actively engaging in this, you working for the police. Indirectly or directly, in one form or another. And that's the reality of it. You know what I'm saying? We got $20,000 to go buy a kilo, go buy a house, go buy some property. And I guarantee that you'll last longer and you'll be in the streets a lot longer. You won't be dead somewhere. You know what I'm saying? You won't have to worry about people trying to rob you and steal from you. You know what I'm saying? This is a dead-end hustle. The drug game is a dead-end hustle, and it took me 13 years of my life wasting it in the streets to understand that. You know what I'm saying? Because I lived this life. This was a life that I actually lived. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of my friends live this too, and they out. And you know what? They're doing so much better now, right, than they ever did in the drug game. Most of my friends that was in the blocks with me, all the property and stuff that they bought now, they did that from hard-earned labor. They didn't do it from the drug game. And I salute them for that. You know what I'm saying? Because they were able to get out and survive before this shit took us all and put us in the grave. You know what I'm saying? So my advice to you young dudes out here who still glorify this, right? And you still think that this is something that's going to get you out of the hood, I can guarantee you it's not. And the reason why it's not, because you're working for the police. And the police ain't going to allow you to escape. Okay? So with that being said, I'm going to get ready to close this up. I went over my time today, but I'll leave the links in the chat. And I'll get ready to see y'all Thursday. Sundays from now on, I'm going to be doing the stream at around the same time because I don't want to interfere with the football. I want to thank everybody for coming out for episode 13. Links in the chat. You know, Y'all see the cash up there? You know, $1 goes a long way, man. If I got 50 people watching and one person sends $1 out of the 50, you know, that goes a long way. So, you know, share. If you don't want to send no money, share, subscribe, share it with somebody else. Somebody else might want to share it and donate. So with that being said, I hope that y'all learned something valuable in this show today. And peace out.